William Shatner famously said that progressive rock is the science fiction of music. Well, bearing that in mind and sticking with the whole universe analogy, let's take a journey through time and space and consider how these planets align. For many, prog is a genre which is a melding of musical virtuosity and ambitious concepts. A music drawn from arguably a European symphonic tradition, or some argue that it's just a bloated, self-indulgent piffle, to quote the late great John Peel. But if we are to stick with the conceit of the universe, I think it's interesting to think about how these titans gravitate and explore the certain atmospheres they evoke. And what has spurred this video, this discussion really, is I'm constantly asked about my own preferences regarding progressive rock. Not that that isn't obvious really from the videos I upload. So I thought I'd indulge myself and converse with you once more about classic 70s progressive rock. Not that I need any encouragement to do that. Many often just lump these bands into kind of one pot, a sort of splodge of progness, but of course this is complex music that is far more nuanced than that. This music, of course, steps away from the vagaries and frilled cuffs of psychedelia to explore new boundaries, which kind of brings us back to the William Shatner quote, doesn't it? He said that progressive rock has the same concept of exploration into the parts of the music world that hasn't been explored. It certainly went where music hadn't gone before, melding the ambition of the counterculture and psychedelia, as well as bringing in the avant-garde and musique concrète and capes as well. And there will be many bands in this video that don't get a mention. This isn't a full comprehensive list. I thought I'd make that clear from the get-go, because you always get in the comments below Mr. Smug Bastard from Shropshire who will try to discredit everything you say and lash me just because I don't mention Badger's Scrotum that played a gig at the Slug and Lettuce in 1972 or thereabouts. Imagine, if you will, a kind of Venn diagram of progness, at the very centre of which sits King Crimson. And of course this diagram expands outwards in ever decreasing circles until we eventually reach Bucks Fizz. As this video is really about my own personal preferences, the two bands that would sit at the very centre of this Venn diagram or prog universe for me would be Yes and Genesis. But it is interesting to kind of mull over how these bands rub along together and how they step into different circles until eventually they kind of become not prog. So as I've said, at the very centre of this prog universe for me is Yes and Genesis. Yes are far more cosmic, which fits into the theme of the video. Genesis, of course, much later on become more rock, have a more transatlantic feel with Phil Collins as a frontman. Who was great, by the way. I take nothing away from him. I mean, he was no Steven Tyler or Mick Jagger for that matter. I mean, those two guys are like self-licking ice creams, aren't they? But Phil did a wonderful job in his own way. But the Genesis I'm concerned with for this video is more the early Tweed and +4 stuff. Yes, for me, have a specific energy to their music, a spiritual quality, if you will. A mere listening to the classic Yes is like a cleansing of the chakras. Whereas Genesis have a churchy public school English pastoral hymnal quality that Yes lack, and draw from the cloistered world of butted crumpets and knob inspections. And their public school thrashings are belied a little bit, I think, by their interest in classical themes and myths. Whereas Yes, rather than the rising damp of Charterhouse, go all cosmic and spliffy on us with Anderson's ethereal warblings about Hindu Shastras and karmas, ultimately alienating their keyboard player, our pub-dwelling friend, as Steve Howe calls him in his autobiography, whose on-stage antics would not curry favour with his bandmates. Then you get the mighty King Crimson that should perhaps sit at the very centre of our universe. They did kind of set the prog ball rolling, didn't they? King Crimson, along with Van der Graaf Generator and Emerson, Lake and Palmer, occupy the darker fringes of the asteroid belt. Icy, exact, bloodless even. Loony lighthouse keepers and larks' tongues in aspic and warlike armadillos. No, I don't mean that as a criticism. I genuinely love these bands, but they evoke a slightly different atmosphere tonally, conceptually and musically. Emerson, Lake and Palmer, as I've said before, draw from that European symphonic tradition, that classical tradition, whereas King Crimson, Fripp's lot lean more towards the avant-garde and musique concrete, as well as jazz fusion. In terms of jazz fusion, I don't think they're as melodic as, say, the Mahavishnu Orchestra, but that's probably just my opinion. Nevertheless, the music they make is certainly at odds with the happy-clappy veganism of Yes. And then we get Gentle Giant. I mean, my God, where do we begin? As batty as a box of frogs, melding all sorts of elements, even medieval chamber music. Gentle Giant for me are the kind of prog equivalent of an eccentric old aunt that smells of vapour rub and unashamedly pisses on the front room carpet. I originally rated Gentle Giant's Octopus as their finest album, but these days I tend to be gravitating more towards their first two albums. And then there's Camel, of course, which is like the prog equivalent of a nice cup of chamomile tea. Lovely, gorgeous textures, beautiful music and ethereal trilling guitar, and of course they don't tie your ears up with all that fiddly diddly stuff, do they? Then we get the Pink Floyd question, prog or not prog, which we've all been chewing the fat over on this channel for a while now. I'll put a video up there for you to check out. For me, I tend to consider them progressive rock. I know Rolling Stone magazine dismissed them as prog light. That was Rolling Stone when it was worth reading, before it was all obsessed with this jiggery wokery. You could take Dark Side of the Moon, a concept album about the pressures of modern life. Of course, you know, progressive rock doesn't have a monopoly on concept albums, but nevertheless, you know, you take the next album, another concept album which really deals with absence. It's also a tribute to a fallen bandmate who rises up in the form of the brilliant and dazzling metaphor of the crazy diamond. But this album contains a sidelong suite of music. Ultimately it's cut in half, of course, but nevertheless with a long ambient and atmospheric introduction exploring the relationship between the keyboard and guitar, beautifully conjuring up those feelings of isolation and abandonment. And that's before we get Animals. Animals, a concept album loosely based upon Orwell's Animal Farm. And again, another almost sidelong piece of music with numerous tempo changes and shifts and musical interludes, including a kind of almost a 3-minute keyboard ambient solo. This is all sounding suspiciously like progressive rock to me. I mean, okay, they don't rub along that comfortably next to the bands I've already mentioned, but do they have to? I mean, progressive rock is a kind of a broad umbrella, is it not? Yes, there's a topographic ocean of difference between Pink Floyd and Yes, but there is between Yes and Camel as well. And many would argue they lack the kind of virtuosity of Yes and King Crimson, but they more than make up for it in their exploration of ambient and spatial atmospheres. And then we get Jethro Tull, one of my favourite bands, but a real bastard to pin down, as slippery as Ian Anderson's codpiece, the old Sprout Bag. They are no doubt one of those satellite bands that orbit the gas giants, I think. We get the Mock concept album that lightly pokes fun at the whole prog genre in 1972. Then we get a Passion Play, which is full-on prog, before they completely shift and make music that's moving towards, I don't want to use the word conventional, but War Child, for example, you know, more conventional song lengths, before exploring more acoustic textures that leads them into the woods, so to speak. Then we get those of you that argue the Moody Blues and the ELO are prog. This is perhaps where you and I might fall out a bit, I guess, but for me, they better occupy kind of symphonic rock and pop element than they do progressive rock. And then there's Supertramp, another band that's often argued to be progressive rock. But for me, Supertramp are more kind of art rock than progressive rock. We do get that neo-prog revival in the 80s, don't we? We get bands like Solstice and Marillion. Marillion, of course, who harken back to Genesis, that classic 70s prog, especially with Grendel, which was kind of Supper's Ready Mark II, even with Fish with face paint and costumes. But whereas Marillion, I think, differ from those prog juggernauts I've mentioned already, is that they were, I think, more political, more picking at the scab of Thatcher's Britain and exploring issues such as substance abuse and class in the form of tea parties at the vicarage. So there you are, I've rambled on way too much, but this was just an itch I had to scratch, and many of you have already switched off, I suspect. But if you are here, I'd be interested to know what your thoughts on what I've said. Leave your comments below. Do like and share this video, as it all helps that big barking dog that is the YouTube algorithm. other than that, I just hope you are well and staying safe. But more importantly, of course, is that you keep listening.